the dust was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated her tongue and settled in the folds of her tattered beige dress. It rose with every shuffling step, a ghost of the ground she was leaving behind. Thirst was a stone in her throat. Hunger, a hollow ache that had long ago sharpened into a constant biting pain. May kept her eyes on the horizon, on the jagged teeth of the mountains that bit into the relentless blue sky. The sun was a hammer beating down on her head, and the heat shimmered off the rocks, making the world waver and swim. Stopping meant dying. She knew this with a certainty that was as solid as the cracked earth beneath her worn-out shoes. Her only anchor to the world she once knew was a small, dented tin box clutched in her hand, its metal warm against her palm. Inside, the last of her 5-spice powder, a scent that was both a memory and a prayer. It was all she had left of her father's kitchen, of a life before this endless, sun-scorched wandering. Then she smelled it, faint, almost lost in the dry air, but unmistakable. Wood smoke. It was a human smell in a landscape that seemed to have forgotten humanity. Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, flickered in her chest. She adjusted the thin strap of her satchel, the coarse fabric chafing her shoulder, and turned her face toward the scent. The terrain grew steeper, the ground shifting from baked dirt to loose scree. Her ankles trembled with fatigue. Pine trees began to appear, their scent a clean, sharp balm against the dust. The smoke grew stronger, a tether pulling her forward. She crested a ridge, her breath catching in her throat, and saw it. A cabin. It was not a welcoming sight. It looked as if it had been carved from the mountain itself, rough-hewn logs stacked with grim purpose, a stone chimney breathing a lazy gray plume into the sky. It was a place of solitude, not of welcome, a fortress. But it was also shelter. It was water. It was a chance at one more day. She started down the slope, each step a careful negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. Fear coiled in her stomach, tight and cold, but the alternative was a certainty she could not afford to face. The cabin grew larger, its single window like a dark, unblinking eye watching her approach. This was a test. The mountain would either accept her or it would break her. As she drew closer, the silence of the place became a presence. It was not empty silence. It was a weighted, watchful stillness. The air was thick with the smell of pine resin, damp earth, and the sharp metallic tang of an axe blade recently used. A stack of perfectly split logs stood near the door, a testament to relentless, solitary work. A man emerged from the cabin as if summoned by her thoughts. He was built like the mountain he lived on, broad and solid. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, when they landed on her, were the color of a winter sky, a flat, hard gray. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, not pointed at her, but ready. He said nothing. He simply stood on the small porch, a human wall between her and survival. May stopped a dozen paces from the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not raise her hands to beg. She did not call out. Her father had taught her that dignity was the last thing a person could lose, and she would not surrender it here. She met his gaze, her own eyes dark and weary but clear. The silence stretched, pulled taut between them. He took in her appearance, the frayed hem of her dress, the sunburn blistering her cheeks, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. His expression did not soften. He was not a man moved by pity. He was assessing her, the way he might assess a deer that had wandered too close to his traps. Worthless or useful? Threat or something that could be ignored? The sun beat down. A bead of sweat traced a path through the grime on her temple. Finally, he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward a hand pump near the side of the cabin. It was not an invitation. It was a concession. A single crack in the stone wall of his solitude. She moved toward the pump, her legs unsteady. The iron handle was cool beneath her trembling hands. The first gush of water was rusty, but the second ran clear and cold. She drank until the stone in her throat dissolved, the water a shock of life in her parched body. He watched her every move, his posture unchanging, his silence a language she was beginning to understand. This was a kingdom of one, and she was an intruder. He disappeared back inside the cabin without a word, leaving the door slightly ajar. After a moment, he returned and set a tin cup of water and a hunk of dark, hard bread on the edge of the porch. He retreated to the doorway, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. An offering, but not a gift. It was a transaction, and the terms were still being decided. May climbed the 2 steps and sat, her back to him, and ate. The bread was coarse and dry, scraping her throat, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. It was fuel. It was life. When she finished, she could feel his eyes on her back. The assessment was not over. She knew what he was waiting for. He was waiting to see if she would simply take the charity and leave, or if she understood the rules of this place, the rules of survival. Usefulness is the only currency that matters. She stood and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. He gave a slight, dismissive grunt. His gaze shifted from her face to a large, disorderly pile of uncut logs lying near the wood pile. "You want a roof for the night? You work," he said. His voice was as rough as bark, a low rumble that seemed to come from his chest. It wasn't a request. It was a command, a trial. He was testing her will, her endurance. He wanted to see if she was just another piece of driftwood washed up on his mountain, or if there was something solid in her. She nodded once and walked to the pile. The logs were heavy, awkward. Her muscles screamed in protest, her arms weak from hunger and days of walking. But she worked. She hauled the logs one by one to the splitting block, creating a new, neat pile for him to work on later. Sawdust clung to her dress, and splinters dug into her palms. Her hands, soft from a life that no longer existed, grew raw and red. She did not stop. She did not complain. She worked until the sun began to bleed orange and purple behind the peaks, casting long, cool shadows across the clearing. He watched her the entire time, sometimes from the porch, sometimes while cleaning his rifle, his silence a constant, unnerving pressure. When the light began to fail, he finally moved. He walked over to her, his heavy boots silent on the packed earth. He looked down at her hands, at the raw, blistered skin. Then he looked up at her face, slick with sweat and streaked with dirt. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the unwavering clarity in her eyes. "Inside," he grunted, "before the dark." The interior of the cabin was as stark and functional as the man who inhabited it. A single room dominated by a large stone fireplace. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a rough wool blanket folded neatly upon it. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. The air smelled of pine, old smoke, and curing leather. It was meticulously clean, a space stripped of all sentiment, designed for nothing but survival. He pointed to the cot. "You sleep there." He did not offer her a wash basin or a change of clothes. Comfort was a luxury this mountain did not afford. He moved to the fireplace, stoking the embers and adding a fresh log. The flames caught, painting the room in a warm, flickering light that softened the hard edges of the place and the man. He hung a black iron pot over the fire and added water from a bucket, then dropped in several pieces of dried, stringy meat, a grim stew for a grim existence. He ate his portion standing by the fire, scooping the contents from a wooden bowl with a spoon. It was sustenance, nothing more. He filled the bowl again and held it out to her. She took it, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. The stew was bland, tough, tasting only of salt and smoke, but it was hot, and it filled the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She sat on one of the hard chairs, eating slowly, making it last. The silence in the cabin was different from the silence outside. It was smaller, more intimate, charged with the unspoken histories of the two strangers sharing the small space. She watched him as he cleaned his bowl, his movements economical and precise. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, the permanent tension in his shoulders. It was the look of a man carrying a heavy, invisible weight, a loss he refused to speak of, a grief that had frozen him from the inside out. She recognized it because she saw it in her own reflection sometimes. A sudden sharp howl echoed from the dark woods outside, a lone wolf calling to the moon. May flinched, the sound raising the hair on her arms. The man, Rowan, she had decided to call him that in her mind, for a man needed a name, even a silent one, didn't even look toward the door. He was part of this wilderness. Its sounds did not frighten him. He was the most dangerous thing on this mountain. He banked the fire for the night, the light dying down to a soft red glow. "The bolt is on the door," he said, his back to her. "Use it." He took a second blanket from a chest and laid it on the floor for himself near the hearth. He was giving her the only bed. It was another crack in the stone, a gesture of something that wasn't kindness, not yet, but was a step away from pure hostility, a recognition of a shared, fragile humanity in the face of the vast, uncaring dark. Morning arrived not with a gentle dawn, but with a sharp gray light that cut through the single window, laying a cold plank across the wooden floor. Rowan was already awake, gone from his spot by the hearth. May heard the rhythmic thud of an axe from outside. The unspoken agreement hung in the air. She had been granted shelter for the night, and now it was time for her to leave. She folded the blanket on the cot, her movements stiff and sore. Her hands throbbed with a dull, persistent pain from the previous day's labor. She walked to the door, her satchel in hand, her heart a cold, heavy knot in her chest. Back to the dust, back to the hunger. He was standing there, just outside, leaning the axe against the wall. He blocked her path, his broad frame filling the doorway. "Where are you going?" he asked. It was the first direct question he had asked about her life beyond his small clearing. "Don't know," she answered, the truth plain and stark. There was nowhere to go. There was only a way. He looked past her, into the cabin, his gaze resting on the small shelf that served as his larder. It held a few sacks of flour and beans, some salted meat, a handful of dried roots, meager provisions against the coming winter. His eyes returned to her, and for the first time they lingered on the small tin she clutched in her hand. She had held it even while she slept, a habit born of having nothing else to hold on to. "What's that?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated for a second, a flicker of possessive fear. It was all she had. But this was the moment, the gate. She had to offer something more than blistered hands. She opened the lid. The scent that bloomed in the cool morning air was a miracle. Star anise, fennel, clove, cinnamon, and Sichuan peppercorns. It was the smell of warmth, of complexity, of a world filled with more than just salt and smoke. It was the smell of a memory, so potent it made her throat tighten. Rowan's nostrils flared. He leaned closer, his stern expression shifting into something unreadable. It was a scent that did not belong on this harsh, lonely mountain. "Spice," she said softly. He looked from the fragrant powder to a freshly skinned rabbit hanging from a hook by the door. His mind, practical and direct, made the connection. An idea. A final, crucial test. He straightened up, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "You can cook?" he grunted. It wasn't a question about skill. It was a question about value. Prove your worth or walk back into the wilderness. He untied the rabbit and handed it to her. It was a silent command. He gestured toward the fireplace, the iron pot, his meager collection of dried roots and onions. He gave her nothing else, no instruction, no encouragement. He sat at the table, picking up a piece of leather and a knife, and began to work on mending a strap, pretending to be occupied. But she felt his eyes on her, a constant, critical weight. This was her stage, her proving ground. The constrained environment of his kitchen was her entire world. May took the rabbit to the small preparation block. Her hands, which had been so clumsy and raw with the heavy logs, now moved with a purpose that was deeply ingrained. This was a language she knew. She jointed the rabbit with a few deft cuts of his sharp knife, her movements fluid and certain. She found a small patch of wild thyme growing near the cabin steps and added it to her small arsenal of flavors. She sliced the onions and roots with precision. Into the pot went the rabbit pieces, seared in a little rendered fat until they were golden brown. Then the vegetables. Finally, she took a tiny, careful pinch of the precious 5-spice powder from her tin and sprinkled it into the pot. It was a sacrifice, using even a little of what she had left, but it was a necessary one. The aroma began to shift. The simple, earthy smell of meat and roots began to deepen, to become something more. The sharp, sweet notes of the spices mingled with the savory scent of the rabbit, creating a fragrance that filled the small cabin. It was not the smell of mere survival. It was the smell of a meal, of intention, of home. Rowan's hands, which had been methodically working the leather, slowed and then stopped. He set the knife down on the table. He was no longer pretending not to watch. He was captivated. His gaze was fixed on the pot simmering over the fire, steam rising from it like a fragile prayer. The sound of her wooden spoon stirring the stew, a gentle, rhythmic clinking against the iron, was the only sound in the room. It was a sound of life, of care, in a place that had been silent for too long. He watched her taste the broth, her expression focused, and add a final pinch of salt. The transformation was complete. She had taken his crude ingredients and spun them into gold. The part of him that had been frozen for years felt a faint, unfamiliar thaw. It was the simple, undeniable power of a well-cooked meal. He had offered her a test, and she had answered with an act of quiet, profound creation. She ladled the stew into 2 bowls and placed one in front of him. He stared at it for a long moment. The broth was rich and dark, the meat tender, the vegetables vibrant. The aroma was intoxicating. He picked up his spoon. The first bite silenced him completely. It was a revelation. The rabbit, which in his hands would have been tough and gamey, was succulent. The roots were sweet, and the broth was a complex tapestry of flavors he hadn't experienced in years. It tasted of more than just its ingredients. It tasted of care, of memory, of a life beyond this mountain. He ate the entire bowl without lifting his eyes, each spoonful a quiet surrender. When he was finished, he pushed the empty bowl away and finally looked at her. The hard, assessing light in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else. Respect. He didn't say thank you. He didn't praise the food. Such words were not in his vocabulary. Instead, he stood up, walked to the door, and said, "There's another rabbit in the east trap." It was his version of an invitation. It meant stay. And so, a new rhythm was born. A silent partnership took root in the small clearing. Each morning, he would go out to check his traps and hunt, and he would leave a full bucket of fresh, cold water on the porch for her. She would tend the fire, clean the small cabin, and prepare the day's meal. They spoke little, but a language of actions began to form between them. She found a tear in his canvas jacket and mended it with neat, precise stitches. He noticed her shoes were falling apart and left a supple piece of deer hide on the table for her to fashion new soles. He would bring her interesting things from the woods, a handful of wild berries, a strange edible mushroom, a sprig of fragrant mountain mint, leaving them on the prep block as a silent offering for her cooking. She, in turn, learned to read the landscape of his moods. A certain tension in his shoulders meant the hunting was poor. A quiet stillness meant he was lost in a memory she could not access. The cabin, once a place of mere shelter, began to feel like something more. The constant, simmering presence of a warm meal transformed the space. The scent of her cooking became a permanent part of the air, overlaying the smells of smoke and leather with something softer, something that spoke of life and continuity. The routine was a bridge, built one small, quiet act at a time, connecting two solitary islands in a vast wilderness. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a man named Finch. He was a trapper who worked the lower slopes, a man whose presence was as loud and jarring as a dropped axe. He rode into the clearing one afternoon, his horse sweating, and swung himself out of the saddle with a noisy grunt. Finch was all sharp angles and restless energy, his eyes constantly scanning, calculating. He saw Rowan on the porch, and then his gaze slid past him and landed on May. A slow, unpleasant grin spread across his face. "Well now, Rowan," Finch called out, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Didn't figure you for the sociable type. Found yourself astray?" Rowan's body went rigid, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. He said nothing, his silence a more potent threat than any shout. Finch ignored the warning, his eyes still on May. "What's she good for?" he asked, the question thick with insinuation. Before Rowan could move, May stepped forward from the doorway. She wiped her hands on her apron, her posture straight, her gaze level. "I cook," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension with the clean edge of a knife. Finch laughed, a short, harsh bark. "Cook?" he scoffed. "Anything can be cooked. Not much can be made worth eating." He unstrapped a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped bundle from his horse. "Got some bear meat here, tough as a boiled boot. I'll make you a wager." He looked from May to Rowan, his eyes gleaming with malicious sport. "She makes this meat taste like something other than misery, I'll give you that sack of flour on my horse. If not—" His gaze lingered on May again. Rowan took a step forward, his shadow falling over Finch. "She cooks," he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the air. "You bring the meat." He paused, his gray eyes as cold as river stones. "And you'll pay for the meal either way." The challenge was accepted. The terms were set. It was more than a bet over a meal. It was a defense of their small, quiet world. Finch, smirking, dropped the heavy package of meat on the porch and swaggered back to his horse. "I'll be back tomorrow at sundown," he called over his shoulder. "Hope you're hungry." The sky, which had been a clear, placid blue, began to curdle in the late afternoon. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered over the peaks, and a restless wind began to whip through the pines. A summer storm was coming, fast and violent. Inside, May focused on her task, marinating the tough bear meat in a mixture of wild berries, vinegar, and a precious few drops of soy sauce she'd carried in a small vial. Rowan watched her, the tension from the encounter with Finch still coiled in his shoulders. The first crack of thunder split the sky, and the rain began, not as a drizzle, but as a sudden, furious downpour. It hammered on the roof and turned the clearing into a sea of mud. A roar grew in the distance, the sound of the nearby creek swelling, transforming from a gentle stream into a raging torrent. Rowan went to the window, his face grim. "The bridge," he said, more to himself than to her. The small log footbridge he had built was their only reliable way across the creek to his best trapping lines. He grabbed his jacket and plunged out into the storm. May watched from the doorway as he fought his way through the deluge to the creek bank. The water was a churning brown monster, carrying logs and debris. A massive, uprooted tree trunk slammed into the bridge supports. The structure groaned, splintering. Rowan waded into the thigh-high current, trying to secure a rope to the main log, to anchor it to a massive pine on the bank. Just as he looped the rope, another log, smaller but moving faster, broke free and struck him hard in the leg. He cried out, a sharp sound of pain swallowed by the storm, and went down. The current immediately began to drag him under. Without a second thought, May grabbed another coil of rope from the porch and ran into the storm. The rain plastered her hair to her face, blinding her. She reached the bank, and with a knowledge learned from a lifetime watching her father tie complex knots for fishing nets, she quickly fashioned a loop and threw it. It fell short. She pulled it back, her hands numb with cold, and threw again. This time it landed near his outstretched hand. He grasped it, and she dug her heels into the mud, pulling with all her strength. She was not strong enough to haul him out, but she could hold him steady. She anchored the rope to the same pine tree, creating a lifeline. He used it to pull himself, hand over hand, out of the raging water, his leg dragging uselessly behind him. He collapsed on the muddy bank, his face pale with pain. The stew for Finch was forgotten. The real test had arrived with the storm. Later, inside by the fire, she cleaned and splinted his leg as best she could. It was broken. A fever began to set in, and with it, the walls around his memory crumbled. He began to talk, his voice low and raspy. He spoke of his wife, of a blizzard years ago. "The cold," he whispered, his eyes unfocused, looking at a past only he could see. "It took her, right here. Couldn't keep the fire high enough. Couldn't keep her warm." The grief, so long locked away, poured out of him. May listened, her heart aching with a shared understanding of loss. She placed another log on the fire, and the flames leaped high, casting a warm, steady glow over his face. "The fire is warm now, Rowan," she said softly. "It's warm now." Finch returned at sundown the next day, the storm having passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. He found a scene of quiet order amidst the chaos. The footbridge was heavily damaged but still stood, secured by a series of intricate, unfamiliar knots. Rowan was resting by the fire, his legs splinted and propped up. May moved between the hearth and the table, a quiet efficiency in her every action. The air in the cabin was thick with the rich, savory aroma of slow-cooked bear stew. Finch's bravado seemed to falter in the face of this domestic tranquility. He looked at Rowan's leg, at May's calm competence, and the smirk on his face faded. May served him a bowl without a word. He ate it, his initial skepticism giving way to grudging admiration, and then to outright astonishment. The meat, which should have been impossibly tough, was tender enough to be cut with a spoon. The flavor was deep and complex, the wildness of the bear tamed by the subtle spices and the slow, patient cooking. It was, he had to admit, the best thing he had ever eaten. He finished the bowl, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and stood up. He reached into his pocket and placed a few coins on the table, more than enough to pay for the meal. He then went to his horse, unslung the promised sack of flour, and set it on the porch. He did it all without a word, his actions a silent concession of defeat and a mark of newfound respect. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the small clearing to its hard-won peace. The weeks that followed saw a new dynamic settle over the cabin. Rowan healed slowly, and May cared for him with a steady, gentle patience. The roles had shifted. He was now the one who was vulnerable, and she was the one who provided, her cooking and care the bedrock of their shared survival. The silence between them changed too. It was no longer a space defined by caution and uncertainty, but one of comfort and understanding. They began to talk more, sharing small, fragmented stories of their pasts. She told him of her father's small restaurant by a great river. He told her of growing up on a flat, wind-swept farm, and of his dream of the mountains. One day, when his leg was strong enough to walk on again, He returned from the woods not with a rabbit or a deer, but with a small, crudely made wooden box. He handed it to her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a piece of soft moss, were seeds. Tiny, dark specks of promise. "For your spices," he said, his voice gruff, unable to fully mask the tenderness beneath. "So you don't run out." He gestured with his chin toward the side of the cabin, where a small patch of earth next to the porch had been cleared of rocks and tilled, the dark soil waiting. It was a garden plot. It was a deed. It was a promise of a future, of putting down roots in this wild, lonely place. It was his way of saying, "This is your home now." She looked from the seeds in her hand to the waiting earth, and a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was hope, solid and real. Later, when a fur trader passed through, Rowan traded several fine pelts for supplies. The trader stayed for a meal, and as May served the stew, Rowan spoke to the man. "This is May's stew," he said, the words simple but momentous. He had given it a name. He had given her a place. The final image of their new life was etched in the quiet dusk. They sat together on the porch steps, the mountains turning purple in the fading light. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air was filled with the mingled scents of her cooking from the warm cabin behind them, and the clean, sharp smell of the pine forest that was his, and now their, home. It was a shared silence that was no longer empty. It was full to the brim.